Hey, what's up, everybody? And it's Sam Sufder, and you are listening to the CloudNative.fm podcast hosted by Cloud Native Islamabad. I'm excited and thrilled to host this show for you, and thanks everyone for tuning in to this episode number 5 of CloudNative.fm podcast. Today is March the 29th, 2021, and in this episode, we dive into how to build, manage, and continuously deploy containers in Azure with my guest, Michael Levan. Michael Levan is an engineer at heart. He's a cloud developer, DevOps pro, and loves helping the community by speaking internationally, blogging, writing books, and creating courses. He is CTO and Senior Partner at CloudSkills.io. CloudSkills.io, a cloud and DevOps enablement consulting and training firm where he spent his time creating real-world based content and consulting for customers around the globe. Want to see what he is up to? Search it over the internet via michaellevan.net or search him on Twitter via the NJ DevOps guy. So let's go ahead and say hi to Michael and get it over to the interview.
Shutterstock Music. Shutterstock Music. Shutterstock Music.
Thank you, Michael, for joining me in this CloudNative.fm podcast episode number 5. And we are talking about today how to build, manage, and continuously deploy container in Azure. And thank you very much. Appreciate your time. What's up? Can you introduce yourself to our audience?
Yeah, sure thing. Thank you for having me. Appreciate it. So yeah, my name is Michael Levan. I'm the CTO and Senior Partner over at Cloud Skills IO. We're a cloud native DevOps development consulting and training firm. So that takes up of course a big chunk of my time. I also speak internationally at different events. I've written a few engineering books, things like that. So yeah, it's pretty much all about me.
It's really interesting because I'm seeing this stuff on cloudskills.io. You're writing about blog posts and you also did a weekly live stream at cloudskills.io. Can you talk about what the live streams are?
Oh yeah, absolutely. So we have our cloudskills.fm podcast, of course, which we put out a few days or a few times per week, and we also have a lot of live boot camps. So pretty much what our core focus is right now is we have a lot of recorded content, but we're really hammering down on the live boot camp stuff. Just because of everything that's going on in the world, people still want to have that classroom field training, that boot camp style training, except what we do is, we've taken the approach of doing the boot camps, except doing them live now. So, we'll have 6-week boot camps, 10-week boot camps, 12-week boot camps, everything in between, sometimes a little bit longer, sometimes a little bit shorter. So right now we're doing a cloud native DevOps boot camp. We're doing an AWS Solutions Architect boot camp. We're doing a Azure Landing Zones boot camp. We're doing some train the trainer boot camps. We actually just announced today a Python for programming for DevOps engineers boot camp. So we're going to be starting that up in April, and I'll be running that one as well. And a lot of the things with our boot camps is it's all hands-on. So you're learning the theory and stuff, of course, because you have to at the end of the day. However, there's several projects in each of the boot camps, so people can actually go through, dive into the projects, learn it all, create their own GitHub, post all the projects up there and things like that. So we're very live boot camp project focused. So yep.
Yes, definitely, because it's a hands-on stuff that people like about it. And your session
Yep.
joined in the past, and you are now teaming up with Mike and Michael, and hopefully we
Yep.
can do a tremendous amount of stuff is waiting for us to be joined by. And really,
Absolutely.
but you're listening to us, I think really check that out, cloudstream.io. It's a very good place. You can learn Azure, AWS, GCP, Python, cloud native stuff, and they have a very good speakers around the world. And it can help you get up to speed in your career, in the tech career, and DevOps and cloud native, SRE, and these kind of stuff. So, Michael, the first
Absolutely.
question from my side on container, how you introduce to container and why you think it's going to be awesome.
Yeah, sure. So, taking it a step back, outside of containers, let's think about, traditional virtual machines, for example. When you think of a virtual machine, there's a lot of things you got to do to get that configured and get the application on it. You got to install an operating system. You got to have X amount of resources like RAM and CPU, hard disk, all that stuff available. Once the virtual machine actually comes up, well, then you got to install everything that you need on it. So if you're running a Python application, you got to ensure you have Python installed. You got to have pip there so you can have all your different packages for Python. Maybe you have some dependencies you have to install. And then finally, after all of that, you're able to, pop an application on there. Maybe it's a binary or something like that, and then run the application. The biggest problem with this is it's very time consuming, especially if you have dev environments, staging or UAT environments, and then of course production environments. It's a lot of time. You're talking a few hours just to get one environment up for one version of an application. Now, when you think about containers, containers are a microscopic portion from a virtualization perspective. There's when you think of the layers, there's no more hypervisor layer, OS layer, and then finally the application. You're just right from the host, right from the kernel that you're on, Windows, Mac OS, Linux, whatever, right on the same kernel. You have a container running any application that you want and as many applications that you want. So that takes you a few minutes to get up and running versus a few hours in a traditional virtualized environment.
Yes, definitely, because in the VM, the password, we were virtualizing the hardware. And when we're virtualizing the hardware, we need to know that now we manage operating system on top of another operating system. And that's going to be
Yes,
the biggest burden. And now the container words, now we are virtualizing the software part of it right now.
exactly,
So that's
exactly,
removing the burden of managing another operating system. Now you can
exactly.
run multiple apps inside a same operating system and just sit, relax, and watch what happens there and how things coming up. And also,
Absolutely.
yes, and when the containers shut down or they have some health effects, we have the management capability to come up the container in a very fastest way. Whether in the
Mhm.
VM words, it takes substantial amount of money and resources to take the virtual machine came up when it goes down. Can you elaborate this point on it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, and you pretty much brought up a perfect example there that, let's say you have an application running in a virtualized environment. Well, you know what? You got to manage the server. Let's say the server goes down. The actual host, like the physical server, the virtual machine, let's say the virtual machine goes down or RAM spikes up for whatever reason or CPU spikes up, something crashes. So all of that, it's like you're still managing everything outside of the software layer, exactly like you said. But when it comes to containers, you really are just managing the application level, that binary that's running on the container, whatever that application is. Maybe you got a Flask app or some backend Go app, or even if you're just running a simple script or something like that, you're no longer worried about so much on the hardware side. You're really just focused on the software, on the application that's running. That way you don't have to worry about, yeah, this hardware is going to go down at 2 o'clock in the morning or something like that. That whole idea is just completely moved away at that point.
Yes, definitely. And in the past, how this DevOps model is going to be changed, because when the in the previously VM words, we write the code and then test it out and move into the QA environment. Then anybody want to test that, and then eventually we move that to the production side. And when
Yep.
from local machine to the production machine, we caught up in so many surprises. Might be I have developed that up in the Linux environment, and then we want to deploy that. I asked my infrastructure engineering team to deploy that, but they deployed that into the Windows environment. So we have our very hurdle of this is whether the fault of infrastructure engineer that is not setting up the requirement of application, or whether it's a fault of developer who doesn't able to understand that my application is going to the production server, and that production server has Windows operating system installed on it. So how this DevOps model is going to be changed in the container worlds, and how it's similar to the existing knowledge we have in the DevOps world.
Yeah, so I'll speak on, purely from a container perspective, because that conversation of infrastructure engineer versus developer, how to get everything going, that's an 8-hour conversation, right? So purely from a containerization perspective, really what's going to happen at this point is, because you're not worried about, is this going on Linux? What flavor of Linux is this going on? Is this going on Windows Server? Is this going on Windows 10? You're not worried about that anymore. You're really more worried about, how do I get this application to whatever container, wherever it's being hosted? Is it in Azure, AWS, GCP, DigitalOcean, wherever? That's really your primary focus. So you essentially package up that container and you turn it into, a container image. Now, of course, well, I would say the most popular containerization engine right now is Docker, right? But that's not the only one. You got CRIO, you got Containerd, you got LXC if you're an old school Linux guy. There's a bunch of different things that you can do there to package up that application and turn it into a container image. So, but we'll just use the Docker image analogy here, because everybody has kind of heard of Docker, but maybe not everybody has heard of LXC. So you pretty much take that Docker image, and before you even package it up, you can run your unit tests, you can run your mock tests, your integration tests, everything against that code in the CI/CD pipeline. So, and this is pretty much purely 99% of the time always done in the CI process. So, you have your CI process and your DevOps pipeline, and you run all of your tests that you need to against the code. Then once all of those tests pass, that's when you could kick off another task in your DevOps pipeline to build the Docker image. So what's really good about this is, that if the image doesn't get built, the application won't get deployed. And if the tests don't pass, the Docker image isn't going to be built. So you're pretty much, getting that security, getting the testing done, whatever type of testing you're doing right at the beginning before anything even happens, versus deploying the application to the virtual machine and then testing it, finding a bug, going back and forth, figuring out where the bug is, and then finally getting the right one deployed. So, luckily with your automated tests and your automated QA process, the pipeline, purely from a containerization perspective, makes it much easier to get the right thing deployed into the right environment.
Yes, definitely. And also, the few of my colleagues are asking about, when they are first heard about container, they are asking about, now we're replicating the production scenario in my laptop. But in the VM,
Yeah.
I don't able to replicate that environment in my laptop, because I
Mm-hmm.
need to manage the entire infrastructure up in order to replicate that. But in the containers world, I can replicate the production scenario and test it out, the why not my container is running in that particular setup. So that is going to be the biggest advantage of container itself.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, you hit the nail on the head there. You don't have to worry about setting up a whole environment for dev, a whole environment for UAT, a whole environment for production. You literally take the container, install Docker Desktop on Windows 10 or Mac OS, wherever, run the container locally and see what happens. Now, of course, there's always going to be the implications of, where am I running it? Is it in Azure? Is the networking set up? Is the security aspect of things set up? But if you're just purely interested in, how does my application handle, you could run it right on your desktop anytime you want.
Yes, Dan. And also, when the first time the VM came up, we see in the cloud provider services like Amazon or AWS, they're providing the managed Azure machines, kind of managed VM machines, that we call it, and Azure is providing us, do Google Cloud providing us, and all the cloud providing. But when we move to the containers, how this model is changed in the cloud, and when we go to the Azure or AWS, what's new we see in the container ecosystem?
Yeah, for sure. So the really good thing is, you know how you were talking before about, hey, I need to install an application, but oh, what if it needs to be installed on Windows or Linux or whatever, right? And there was that always that confusion there. From a containerization perspective, and if you think of the cloud, you're not going to get that because, for example, let's say you have a Python Docker image and you want to run it in Azure via Azure Container Instances, or you want to run it in AWS via Elastic Container Services or AWS Fargate. The process of the application, like, that doesn't really change. You kind of just pick up the Docker image and move it to wherever you want. Now of course there will be, the components that'll change in terms of like the networking in AWS or the networking in Azure. Is this application listening on port 8080? Is port 8080 open for this VPC or this VNet? So you're always going to have things like that you have to configure. But in terms of just like the application itself, you could literally pick up that Docker image and put it anywhere you want to. It doesn't even matter where it's running.
Yeah, and also to talk about the containers and images and container kind of stuff. Now we have a Docker Hub, and then we go to the Azure or AWS. What's they providing us as a container registry, and why we are what in what scenario we're using Docker Hub, and in what scenario we're using the Azure Container Registry or other registries.
Yeah, really good question. So in Azure, you got the Azure Container Registry. In AWS, you have a container registry as well. I believe GCP has a container registry. Don't quote me on that. I'm not 100% sure. I'm pretty sure they do though. So, let's say you're a 100% Azure shop, probably makes sense to use Azure Container Registry. Let's say you're a 100% AWS shop, probably makes sense for you to use the AWS Container Registry. But if you're, let's say you got a little bit of stuff on prem, maybe you got a little bit of stuff in Azure, a little bit of stuff in AWS, or if you're thinking at some point you may use hybrid cloud, then at that point it would probably make sense for you to use Docker Hub. It really depends on what type of environment you're in. So if you're like multi-cloud or multi-environment, Docker Hub probably makes sense. If you're 100% Azure and you're not moving out of Azure anytime soon, putting it in the Azure Container Registry is perfectly fine. And here's the thing too, like, let's say you put it in the Azure Container Registry and a year down the road, your company's like, oh, hey, we're going to go do something in AWS. Just take that Docker image and throw it up in Docker Hub or an AWS Container Registry. It's not a one and done thing. You could move that Docker image wherever you want. So
Yeah, and
yeah, you're not locked in.
yeah. And on the topic of this discussion that people are always asking about, that whether I can use containers on Azure, whether I can use container on AWS, in what scenarios I'm going to go for the Azure side, or what scenario to AWS side. I think question is quite a tricky one, but people are always ask about these kind of stuff.
Absolutely. Yeah. So, I mean, in terms of the container, like where you could run it, you could run it anywhere: GCP, DigitalOcean, Alibaba, Azure, AWS. Like, it doesn't really matter. You could run it anywhere. They all have the ability to run a container. And let's say you find a cloud that doesn't have, some sort of containerization service. You just spin up a VM in the cloud and install Docker there and run the container. So you could really run it anywhere. It's just a matter of what cloud environment you're comfortable with, honestly. If you're an Azure guy or gal, run it in Azure. If you're into AWS, run it in AWS. If you're into GCP, run it in GCP. It's really more about, what you're comfortable with. Now, what I will say is I'm personally a huge fan of Azure Container Instances. I think that it's a very well and sought out product. I think that a lot of people can run containers very, very easily in ACI. So, if you're looking for, you got a clean slate, you're not running anywhere, I would definitely check out Azure Container Instances first.
Yes, definitely, because I think Azure Container Registry is very good at it. One thing that if you can configure a CI/CD pipeline in a way that can,
Mhm.
if any time new container image is brought up into the Azure Container Registry, is looking for that, and then it deploy immediately into the production environment as well. So you can define
Exactly.
configure hook as a CI/CD environment as well. So
So true.
so now we have few more minutes. We can talk about on containers on as a Kubernetes and as
Yep.
Azure Arc side as well, because I seen you
Absolutely.
have some videos that's showing up in the Gke Autopilot stuff on Azure
Yep.
Kubernetes service stuff, GitHub stuff, and these. So we can start from Azure Kubernetes service that's Azure provided.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So, let's kind of think about Kubernetes, as if you're not familiar with Kubernetes, think about, a car, think of Docker as an engine, a car engine, right? And let's say you want to get anywhere, you need a body and wheels, you need somewhere to put the engine. And that's really what orchestration or Kubernetes does for you. It allows you to take a container and scale it out. You could have 50 of the same application running to ensure you have high availability. You can have auto healing, a bunch of different things that you can have with orchestration. So when it comes to Azure Kubernetes services, and to be honest with you, any Kubernetes service like Google Kubernetes Engine, Elastic Kubernetes Service in AWS, Azure Kubernetes Service in Azure, they're all the same thing. Really, what they're doing is they're essentially taking multiple layers of abstraction so you don't have to worry about managing the master nodes, so you don't have to worry about the upkeep of the server, because you could install Kubernetes right now on a bunch of Ubuntu VMs. You could absolutely do that and have the same exact product as AKS. The biggest difference is you got a lot to manage. So all of these, Kubernetes as a services are to give you the ease of use. You're really just worried about the application at that point, not, managing the entire cluster and the server and stuff like that. So yeah, that's pretty much what, any of these Kubernetes services are going to give you, is just a way to take that Docker image that we were just talking about and scale it out wherever you want to.
Yeah, definitely. Because in the production environment, you have this flexibility that your containers are going to be shut down, but they are the half prop that they define. They have some CPU, RAM. So anytime I see the drift from the desired state, let's say I have a two instance of application running, I want them to always running at two at this time in the production. So one of them is down. So Kubernetes is very tremendous, and they are looking for that, and then it brought up eventually, and you don't have to sit or relax and watch. And
Exactly.
yes, and also we see another very good service that is Azure providing as the Azure Arc. So let's say
Yes.
people are asking about, we are, don't know what the Azure is, we don't know what the AKS is. So what the Azure Arc certainly does is, if you don't know these kind of stuff, we know that Azure Kubernetes, and we're managing that for you, whether it's sitting on their on-prem infrastructure or whether on any other cloud. So
Yes.
can you
Sure. Yeah. Sure. Yep. So Azure Arc. Now let's think about a scenario here. Let's say you're a large organization and you got some stuff on-prem, maybe in like Hyper-V or ESXi, something like that. Maybe you got some stuff in AWS. Maybe some teams have some stuff in Azure and GCP. So here's the thing. That's fine. Hybrid cloud is great, but the problem is like managing all of that, right? Like you're logging into GCP, you're logging into the ESXi vSphere portal, you're logging into Hyper-V, you're logging into AWS, you're logging into all these different places, and that's cumbersome. So what Azure Arc does is, instead of having to log into all these places to manage the resources, you can manage the resources in one single place, and that single place is Azure Arc. Now, in terms of Azure Arc for Kubernetes, same rules apply. Let's say you're running a Kubernetes cluster, in ESXi, via a bunch of Ubuntu machines, or you're running a Kubernetes cluster in Google Kubernetes Engine in GCP. What you can do is you can manage all of those different Kubernetes clusters in one place, and that one place is Azure Arc for Kubernetes.
Yeah, and for on the topic of Kubernetes, we started from the containers to the Kubernetes. And let's start another discussion right now on the new wave that is coming up in the everybody talking about and learning about. That is GitOps. So can you introduce
Yes.
what the GitOps is and why it's going to be so popular right now in the market?
Sure. So GitOps is essentially you have, let's say, GitHub, right? You have all of your code, all of your configurations in GitHub for Kubernetes. So again, I'm going to keep going back to this Python app because I've been writing a bunch of Python code lately. Let's say you have a Python application, some Flask application, and it's sitting in GitHub, and you want to be able to deploy that to a Kubernetes cluster, but you want to ensure that there's no configuration drift. Well, that's exactly what GitOps is doing for you. GitOps is you use something like GitHub to have the source of truth, and Kubernetes, let's say you're running an AKS, that Kubernetes cluster is constantly checking in with your GitHub repo and looking at the code. If anything changes there, if that source of truth changes, it also changes on the Kubernetes cluster. So pretty much think of it like, configuration management 2.0. It's really what it is. Let's say like if you're familiar with Ansible, Ansible has something where it's constantly checking in to ensure that your configuration hasn't changed, and if it has changed, it redeploys something new. That's configuration management. So with GitOps, it's doing the same thing, except it's using GitHub as your source of truth. So, you go into your app.py file and you change one of your templates that you're rendering in your Flask app. As soon as Kubernetes checks into source control and sees that change, it's now going to be automatically deployed to your Kubernetes environment.
Yeah, and for the one last topic that we doesn't even heard about, that's a new we see. Google has announced this GKE kind of autopilot
Mhm.
stuff, and I
Yep.
see, I watched your video and learned so many cool stuff what it is and why it is actually. So can you draw some point on wow how GKE is different from GKE Autopilot?
Yes, absolutely. So it's autopilot is an absolute game changer. I remember maybe 6 months or a year ago, I was thinking to myself and kind of talking about it a little bit publicly. I'm like, you know what? Services like AKS and GKE and EKS, they're all really cool and they take a lot of management overhead away from you. But the problem was that what you still had the worker nodes. So you have the master nodes and you have the worker nodes. The master nodes you're not dealing with, but the worker nodes you were still dealing with. They would be spun up as like EC2 instances or virtual machines or something like that. So you still had these servers that you kind of sort of had to manage at the end of the day. Um, so I was thinking, like I said, like 6, 12 months ago, I was talking about this. I was like, when are we going to get to a point where all we care about is the API? It's all I want to care about. I just want to worry about the API and where my application is being deployed to, and that's it. And that's exactly what Gke Autopilot does for you. There's no more worker nodes. You're not managing the master node, nothing. There is zero infrastructure that you're worried about. You are simply worried about taking your application and deploying it. And that's it. And the other really cool thing about Autopilot is you're no longer getting charged for like clusters, or I'm sorry, you're no longer getting charged for nodes. So, for example, let's say you had 3 nodes running your worker nodes, and you know what? Maybe you didn't need all those worker nodes because the application load wasn't that great. However, you needed the worker nodes so you were highly available and highly scalable. With Autopilot, you actually get charged per pod, which is awesome because you're literally just getting charged for the application that you're running. So yeah, Autopilot is a complete game changer. It's if I have any opportunity to consult and tell somebody, hey, what Kubernetes version do you want to go with at this point? I think I'm going to definitely be recommending Autopilot.
Yeah, definitely. Because I think Google is the first one that came up with the Google Kubernetes or
Yeah,
Kubernetes as a service kind of a stuff. So now they have a new model of it because they are the company that's creating the open source tool that's called Kubernetes, and then the GKE, and now they have GKE Autopilot, the game changer.
yeah,
Really enjoy the
exactly.
whole discussion of containers, Kubernetes, GitOps, GKE, AKS, learn so many cool stuff. I'm really enjoy. I want that we can talk about all these kind of stuff all day, all night. But you have a lot of all the stuff you have to do as well. But it's really appreciated, and I hope I can catch up with you with again in future on some other stuff as well, like GitOps.
Of course.
We can do a podcast or we can GKE and these kind. So it kind of summarizes what we learned today. So we have containers are the go-to, and you can say is a go-to platform for you to build your application in a way that is comprises of images, and then you brought up whether it's on Linux, VM, or in the cloud or on-prem anywhere. And once you're comfortable with container, you go for the Kubernetes, the orchestration layer. And if you don't want to manage yourself, go ahead for check out the Azure Kubernetes service, GKE or Gke Autopilot or EKS, any way you like. And once you're comfortable with on Kubernetes, go for the GitOps things. And Michael Levan has a very good some walkthrough tutorial in YouTube as well. Definitely check that out. If you're watching that in YouTube, I will put out the link in here, and it's going to be tell you why GitHub is so famous in a very small amount of time. And I think this is a game changer as we're moving about, because if it doesn't talk about these kind of things, and somebody talking about these kind of things, you can be lag behind that. And in the industry, we always think about if you snooze, you lose. And you have so many opportunities for learning these kind of stuff. And go check out, anybody who are listening to us, go check out cloudskills.io. They have Cloud Native DevOps Bootcamp, AWS Bootcamp, Python for the developer. That's a new one coming up. They have a Cloud Skills podcast as well, Cloud Skills weekly live stream as well. So I highly recommend you check these out resources for you. This will give you up to speed on DevOps, Cloud Native, and all kind of things. So thank you, Michael Levan. I really enjoy chatting with you tonight, and hopefully catch up you again in the future. Thank you, Michael.
Absolutely, man. Take care.
Bye bye. Hey everybody, if you want to keep up what's going on in the cloud native ecosystem, we have a weekly podcast show on YouTube and SoundCloud by the name of Cloud Native Islamabad. You can listen for free every single week. We try to find cloud and cloud native experts, share updates on cloud native best practices, cloud native real-world use cases, cloud native deployment patterns, cloud native deployment strategies. Topics include AKS on Azure, EKS on AWS, GKE on GCP, cloud native architectures, cloud native application developments, containerizing application, DevOps and automation, cloud native certification strategies, cloud native career tips, and more. So if that sounds awesome to you, head over to the SoundCloud and YouTube and subscribe to Cloud Native Islamabad.